Okay, so it is my pleasure to rise today to speak to Bill 41, the Wildlife Amendment Act. And I would like to thank the Minister for bringing forward this bill. I'd also like to thank the Minister for giving us so many opportunities to talk about wildlife in the House this spring. So, which is great. That's why I became an MLA, was to represent wildlife in this room. So there is a lot of really good things in this bill. It does introduce technical updates to hunting regulations. In particular, I am pretty fond of the requirement that no domestic sheep and goats will be accompanying hunters while hunting wild sheep and goats. This is one of the only truly conservation-minded parts of this bill, but that is actually about protecting wild goat and sheep populations from diseases that can be carried by domestic sheep. I would say that that is the part of the bill that is the easiest to support and truly get behind. It really is about protecting wild populations of sheep and goats. The Minister talks a lot about balance and stewardship in his opening remarks, and I echo that. Hunting plays a very important role in our society, and it is also one of the many ways that Albertans have an opportunity to appreciate and recreate on Crown lands. So it is a thing that Albertans do, my husband included, for which I am very grateful, because I certainly appreciate his efforts when we have a moose in the freezer. And that being said, I also believe that ethical hunting is very important, and there are parts of this bill that improve our ethics in this realm of hunting. So I know that I have received some questions about the use of lasers for sighting, and I actually agree that this is an important technology to improve accuracy and to reduce the risk that an animal will be wounded in the field and then not actually harvested, which of course is the scenario that nobody wants to see, right? So I also like that. I do have some questions that I feel we can explore as we debate this bill. In particular, how some of these things will be reflected in regulations. So I do appreciate the clause of using electronic tags issued. However, I am curious how that will be enforced in the field. What if a conservation officer or fish and wildlife officer finds somebody hunting, asks them for their tag, and they don't have their phone? Or their phone is dead because it's cold outside and it doesn't have enough battery. So I feel that we need to really kind of flesh out some of these scenarios and the application in the regulations as they're being developed to make sure that people are hunting with a valid tag and not just hunting without the proper licensing or the proper permissions from the government. The other thing that I think is really important in the regulations piece is this idea of minors using firearms. So in my conversations with constituents and stakeholders, this is definitely the part of the bill that I would say Albertans are the least comfortable with. It does conjure images of minors running around with guns, because that's kind of what it is. I do appreciate that this bill is actually bringing provincial legislation in line with federal legislation, and I thank the Minister for clarifying that parents can place conditions on a minor's license. And I also know that this is important for rural communities, that a lot of rural Albertans are growing up learning how to hunt ducks on the back 40 pond or, in their back 40 forest. And I think that is an important part of rural life and rural culture. But we also need to make sure that when we're talking about any kind of legislation that involves firearms, that we are prioritizing safety. And so I encourage some conversation and some reflection on how do we guarantee safety when we are allowing minors to hunt on their own with loaded weapons. And in thinking about this whole clause and minors with guns, for hunting purposes, I was trying to imagine what it would be like. So, as the MLA for Banff-Kananaskis, the Ghost Public Land Use Zone is in my riding. It is an area where I frequently recreate. I go hiking, I take my dog out there. My husband hunts out in the Ghost, although not with much success, in large part, he's gonna hate that I said that. In large part because the Ghost is this crazy landscape full of people recreating and motorized vehicle recreation that is not very well managed. And the population of people recreating in the Ghost Ploughs and in the Kananaskis Ploughs continues to increase regularly. And so if I am imagining minors with guns, or really anybody with guns hunting in the Ghost and in the Kananaskis Ploughs, if I'm prioritizing public safety, I think it's very critical in this conversation to separate people who are hunting and people who are target shooting. And overall, I would say that shooting in general on public lands is very poorly managed, and it does make people feel unsafe. So I, for example, stopped going for hikes in the Ghost a couple of years ago because the last time I went with my dog, there was gunfire all around me, and I didn't actually know which direction I could walk in safely. I recognize that most of those people are target shooting and not hunting, but it does create an opportunity for us to be very thoughtful and considerate about how we manage shooting in general on public lands. Last summer, I think it was last summer, the minister introduced a shooting restriction in the Ghost associated with the Trans-Alta Road, but all of that has done is push shooting to a different part of the public land use zone. So if this legislation is going to increase the opportunity for more people to have loaded weapons on public lands and actually increase the opportunity for youth to have loaded weapons on public lands, I think that there's a very important conversation about safety that needs to happen. And that doesn't necessarily have to be reflected in the legislation, but I do hope that we engage Albertans in this conversation and reflect some of those needs for safety in the regulations around this idea of minors using firearms. I want to also go back a little bit and just kind of talk about the overall intention of this bill is to increase opportunity for people to hunt, and perhaps people who are not currently hunting to explore hunting as a way to gather food or as a way to recreate. And modernizing the technology behind hunting may help to do that. So decreasing the weight for bows, for example, can enable smaller frame people, women and youth, to engage in bow hunting. I mean, I'm not opposed to that. However, I will say the thing that this bill doesn't do is actually address the biggest concern that Albertans have right now, which is that hunting and trapping quotas are increasing beyond sustainable limits for wildlife and not based on science. And this bill does not address that big concern of Albertans. And why that's problematic, Mr. Speaker, is because if we are creating a bill that promotes or encourages more people to hunt, and at the same time lifting hunting and trapping quotas for everybody, then it does kind of raise questions around the sustainability of hunting and the sustainability for our wildlife populations over the long term. That, I think, is the biggest concern for me in this bill. So, you know, the bill itself contains modernization pieces, which, as I said, I do support. And I do support hunting, especially hunting for subsistence in Alberta. I mean, I don't know how to say this any other way, but I really like having a moose in my freezer. And if my husband is watching this debate right now, please bring home a moose. Or an elk. An elk is also acceptable. Wild game meat in Alberta is awesome, and we do have a lot of it available for us. The important thing to remember is that I do also truly believe that the definition of hunting quotas, limits, tag numbers, all of that needs to be defined by the best available science and data on population size, population density, immigration, emigration, reproductive age and rate, and a whole bunch of other biological factors of these species. We need to make sure that hunting and trapping are sustainable activities so that we can continue to do them, and that I can continue to have elk in my freezer, hopefully. I want to emphasize that currently science is not the foundation of how decisions are being made for hunting and trapping. And that lack of use of science has also created considerable public distrust in this minister's ability to sustainably manage hunting and trapping limits. And I see that distrust reflected in the emails that I receive from constituents who really look at this bill and have pretty serious concerns about it, not because of the contents of the bill, but because they don't actually trust this UCP government to sustainably manage our wildlife populations. And this bill doesn't go anywhere towards addressing that significant concern that the public have and that I have also. There is a clause in here that dogs on leash can be used to recover animals responsibly. I appreciate that also. As I have said, I appreciate the need to recover wounded animals in the chase. The minister also made reference to fair chase. I will just point out the irony here that the only people now who are allowed to have off-leash dogs in wildland provincial parks are those people who are hunting cougars and using dogs off-leash to hunt cougars, and arguably that is not fair chase. There are ethical questions about how we hunt cougars, and I think that even though that is a long-standing practice and that, you know, a lot of Albertans do engage in that activity, I do think that sometimes it's worth, as a society, examining the things that we assume to be true and the things that we assume to support just because it's always happened that way. There are many Albertans who are not comfortable with the knowledge that the only people who can have an off-leash dog in a protected area is somebody who is there to hunt a cougar. I think there's a broader public conversation that we're not having with this bill, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker. The idea that hunters don't need to anchor boats in order to hunt waterfowl also raises concerns for me in the regulations and enforcement. So I'm just imagining somebody out there on a wetland and they're hunting some ducks and they're cruising around in their little boat. And what is to stop that person from rushing ducks on the edge and flushing them into the air and then turning the engine off and hunting them? So that also brings to mind questions around fair chase. Like, what is fair chase? There are people who are concerned about this idea of not having boats anchored in the water and what that might do for fair chase with waterfowl. I recognize it brings us in line with the Migratory Bird Act, and I'm grateful for that. But again, I think this is a deeper conversation that we need to have when we're developing the regulations for these things. The removal of permit requirement to transport injured wildlife, again, I'm curious to see how that plays out in the regulations. Which species will be included, which ones won't be. I can't imagine that bears and wolves and cougars are included in that list of animals that you can transport without permission, or at least I hope very much not. But even birds of prey can be very difficult to handle if they are only minorly injured. And so in the regulations, will there be sort of tips and tricks for people to use if they do happen to hit an owl or a hawk and need to transport it to a wildlife rehabilitation facility? I think there's some details that I don't expect to see in legislation, but I definitely want to see in regulation. Section 103(1) in this bill is amended to include clause Z.1 around respecting, feeding, and attracting wildlife, including prohibitions. As somebody who has spent a large part of my career focusing on human-wildlife coexistence, large part of conflict is caused by inappropriate feeding and wildlife attractant management on property. I love that this is in the bill that we are debating, that there is recognition that feeding and having food available for wildlife is a problem, and we need to be able to enforce that. However, I will also comment, Mr. Speaker, that in order to hunt black bears, we bait them. And we set bait, and then hunters sit in a tree, and they wait for a black bear to come, and then they hunt that black bear. I have problems with that not being fair chase too, I will just say. However, that is how we hunt black bears, and that is how it has always been done. That doesn't mean that we can't question that right now. And in particular, as a bear biologist, I have had pretty significant concerns, and I know some of my other biologist colleagues do as well, of creating these bait traps specifically for black bears in one area where also within that same bear's home range, we're telling people to reduce food and attractants to reduce conflict. So there is a very mixed message here, and Mr. Speaker, I happen to think that bears are very, very smart, and they're capable of weighing a whole bunch of information and making decisions, but I will also tell you that they are very food-driven, and I don't think that bears are going to be able to distinguish, well, this bait is food, but this is because somebody wants to hunt me, and this food over here in somebody's yard, I can't have that because that puts me in conflict. So I appreciate having something in legislation that is about attractant management, but again, I think we need to consider how we hunt black bears in this province and how those baits potentially increase human-bear conflict risk in areas where we allow that. There is a lot of things in wildlife management, Mr. Speaker, that become very complex when you actually start to think about how they are implemented on the ground. And that is the reason why wildlife management needs to be founded in data and science and not public opinion. The people have very strong opinions about wildlife, myself included. But when we use science to inform decision-making, particularly around hunting and trapping quotas, we might find that we would manage hunting and trapping differently. I keep hearing from some people that hunting contributes to conservation in the province. And that is true. Money from hunting tags does go to the Alberta Conservation Association. But I also just want to acknowledge that a lot of conservation in this province happens outside of this world of hunting and trapping. Hunting is not the only way that we fund conservation efforts in Alberta. And so let's just keep in mind and remember that there are many, many stewards of this land. Many of them are not hunters and trappers. And just because somebody doesn't hunt or trap doesn't mean that they can't be part of this conversation around how we sustainably manage hunting and trapping. I really cannot emphasize enough, Mr. Speaker, how much I wish science and data was part of this conversation, or even part of this bill. I have not seen data that demonstrates that some of these things are needed, although some of them do make sense to me as a wildlife biologist. The last thing I'll say, Mr. Speaker, that is glaringly missing in this bill is there is no mention of Indigenous people, Indigenous youth, treaty rights, or hunting access. When I talk to Indigenous elders and leaders and residents in my riding and more broadly in Alberta, the #1 thing they tell me is that they wish they had more access to exercise treaty rights, including hunting and trapping for subsistence. How were Indigenous communities consulted in this bill? What will this bill do to increase Indigenous access for hunting and trapping and the exercising of treaty rights? I feel confident that some of my colleagues will get much more into detail on that than I will, but I will just say that when we talk about managing wildlife, Mr. Speaker, it is an excellent opportunity to demonstrate how we live truth and reconciliation, and that we don't just talk about it, we actually implement it. And so while this bill is decent, it doesn't make me angry, which I think is a huge move forward. There are some pretty significant pieces missing, and I look forward to debate and hearing how those may be addressed. Thank you.